and welcome to this week's episode of Menu Combat, the beginning of what is Season 2. I'm your host, The Wolves Den, and if you love to pause and customize your party, you're in the right place. Menu Combat, a JRPG podcast. And there are three parts to Menu Combat that you should always expect. You should expect something I'm reflecting on, what I've been grinding on, and what is the Bard's Tale of the week. And this week, I've been really reflecting on what does it take to get back into an RPG. You might be like, okay, so what do you fully mean by that? So I am a very haphazard gamer, right? So it is not unusual for me to put down a game I even like, or I'm in the mood of, and just switch moods or switch gears. It is very, not rare, but it's not very often that it's like the minute I commit to a game, that that's the only thing I'm playing. And that's for multiple reasons. One of the big ones is because of what my work requires. My work is a little bit all over the place, so I'm not always in a place where I'm going to be committed to a large experience, so to speak. And so sometimes I'll like, oh, I'm playing this big game, but I'm like, no, I want something smaller, something I can get a little bit more bite-sized and put it away. And so what that means is that there are plenty times where I've been playing a JRPG, playing a game that I love, and then I just put it down and don't go back to it for years. And I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. But what is challenging is when you put down an RPG and then you pick it back up a year, 2 years later, and you're like, okay, let me get my bearings again. Let me figure out what's going on. That is a hard challenge. And so I have a couple of examples to kind of work through, tell you how I did it. And I'd love to hear, what do you do after you put down an RPG, let's say for 6 months, a year, maybe even more than that? What do you do to kind of get back your bearings of playing? And so I'll use one that I think is like a really good example of how I do things. Final Fantasy IX. I got Final Fantasy IX when my friend gave me his PS4. He gave me his PS4 back in like 2018. And so he gave me it around 2018, and I got Final Fantasy IX, and I didn't get very far. But for one reason or another, most likely because I was in a graduate program, I didn't continue. And so what I ended up doing was I left it alone, and it wasn't until about 2021, somewhere around that time, 2021, 2022, do I actually pick up Final Fantasy IX. So you're talking about a 5-year break. And I'm going to tell you, I did not remember anything. I'm just going to be honest. I stepped in and I was in I think it's the ice place. And I was just like, okay, what was I trying to do? What was my goal? What was my step-by-step? And that is just actually the first part of trying to figure out what's going on. It's just like, what was my original goal that I left off of? But that's not the only thing, right? Because that is usually like, okay, what's your first thing you always try to think of is like, all right, what is my goal? What am I trying to do? And so I was in the ice palace. I'm like, oh, where am I trying to go? And I figured I was like, oh, I was near a boss battle. And I was like, okay, this is where I was. But that wasn't the only thing I had to remember. I was like, okay, what happened up until this point? Which ironically, for those who know, the ice place in Final Fantasy IX is like first disc. So it isn't this super far into the game. But that doesn't mean I remembered what happened. And so I did what I think most people would do. I think his name is called Recapitation on YouTube. And he had a nice little bit of a description of the Final Fantasy. But I caught myself and I'm like, oh, you're about to start spoiling stuff. Because it's not, sometimes when they do the story recaps, it isn't just 100% linear. And so on top of listen to Recapitation, who, again, I'm shouting him out. He's an excellent YouTuber. The other thing sometimes I do is just go watch other Let's Plays and be like, oh, that's what this beat was. Oh, that's what this beat was. And I start to place that together. And the fortunate thing is that the last piece of FF9, obviously, is what were you trying to do? What is the story beat I'm building on? The last piece, which I think is interesting to think about, is just what mechanically is going on. The thing is that FF9, from a mechanic standpoint, is pretty straightforward. And because I'd spent so much time with stuff like Final Fantasy Tactics, Advance, the idea of building skills through weapon equipping, none of that's hard. That's really easy to like put together. And remember, that's not FF9, as much as I love it, mechanically isn't a very dense game. And so once I figured out what my goal was and what the story beats were, I was off to the races. And the thing that I think most people would say is like, oh, if you do that, you're going to lose out on the experience. You're going to dislike the game for that break. No. FF9 is one of the greatest games I've ever played. And the only thing that I ever say negative about that game is that it's a slow game, but that slowness has nothing to do with my break I took. It's just a slow game. Anybody who's even played the remaster, them battles be taking so long. You look at your watch, you're like, oh man, is someone done yet? No diss to Ico and there, but it's just like, that's just what it is. And so when I think of the game from a pacing perspective, right? Because you'd think about taking a break in an RPG can affect and mess your understanding of pacing. And I'd agree, but I don't really think there are any issues from a pacing perspective for FF9. And I don't think me taking a break or the gap made things feel longer or shorter. The only times that I ever really feel a game getting antsy for me, or at least let me use FF9 specifically, is when I want to finish it, where I'm like, okay, I'm just going to grind and try to finish this. That's a different energy, but outside of that, I think it's a well-paced game. I think Disc 1, 2, 3 works out well. Like, it's pulled together, and I guess I'm bringing this to the forefront, because I know I'm not the only RPG guy who takes a break. I know not just that, is that I don't think it inherently changes your experience. And there's a side note that I guess I'll bring to the forefront, is that I often think that there are two types of gamers. There are those who buy a new game and they blitz it. And then there are those who I think who bite-size their game. They go bits and pieces. And I think game designers think more for the first group, which is fine. I don't think that's inherently wrong. I just think that, especially for the games that we choose, where these are long games, we might put in a quick 20 hours and we put it down for a while and then we'll come back up to pick it up, because these are longer games. And so I even think the desire to take a break or desire for something new is always a little bit easier to be distracted versus when you're playing a 4-hour game where you're like, oh, I can blitz that. But if you want to blitz FF9, you got to put in at least about 20 to 30 hours. And that's because of the remaster. But I guess for you all, have you ever found that taking a break from a game affects how you perceive the pacing? As I said, with FF9, I think it's a pretty briskly paced game. I think everything holds up. I guess what I'm getting at is that my breaks don't feel like they affect the experience of the game. And I think it could, but I don't know. Here's another good example. I think I talked about in this podcast my appreciation of Tales of Vesperia. And it's great. And so the hard part was trying to remember all the specific combat stuff. Remembering what I was doing is usually not that difficult in Tales of Vesperia. You just do a quick search and you're like, oh, okay, that's what I'm doing. And everything else came back. And I don't even think the story was so intense where I'm like, who was doing what? What's the story beat? Like those things stayed with me, particularly because I probably took like a 6-month break or something like that. What I think was difficult, and this is why I was like, this is a good example to think about, is that mechanically, it was a lot to try to piece back together. Think about when I did the episode around Tales of Vesperia, I made an emphasis on Fatal Strikes. And it took me a while to like figure out how the Fatal Strikes work, and then figuring out how the different combo moves work. Taking a while to figure out how do you do a Mystic art and how that's different from a Burst art. Like, that's the stuff that you forget in that game. And it's because it's so mechanically rich and dense that, yeah, you can go back and just button mash through other regular enemies. But the moment that you get to a boss battle and you're hard checked, as in like you need to improve your skill, you need to know how to link these things. And that is where I had to like Google search. Okay, I saw the words Mystic Art. I saw the words Burst. What are you doing? Because you read item descriptions, right? It's another game where you build your skill set through item usage. But just trying to understand what those meant, right? In FF9, that was really simplistic, a little bit straightforward. But in Tales of Vesperia, there's a little bit more meat on the bone and things aren't as clear or straightforward. And I think that is actually one of the interesting things about JRPGs compared to other games, where it's like mechanically you can forget so much because there's so much richness at the table of what these games can look like. And so I would say because we say all of that to say, it's like, did my breaks of Tales of Vesperia affect how I perceived it? It might make me a little bit more generous, because I was more intentional on coming back with an understanding of the gameplay systems, because I think I understood it better the second time than the first time I was playing. And I do think that Some of the times I took a break was indication of like, pacing kind of getting whatever. Because I'm thinking of beginning at the end of Act 1. After I finished the end of Act 1, I'm like, this is great. But I didn't really care for the start of Act 2. So that's where my break really happened. And so that might also be another thing for us to think about, where it's like in my Tales of Vesperia experience, the different acts felt like natural places I could break. And so I guess that's another good question to think about. Is like, do different acts in a game make you feel more inclined to take a break? Like, okay, I've reached Act 1 or Act 3. I can put this down and then come back later, a few months down the line. Do you ever feel motivated like that? But I think for me, that is where if you're not enjoying the new part of a chapter, you're more likely like, I'm nearly the beginning. I'm going to put it down. And I think pacing-wise, Vesperia is pretty good, but there are part of Act 2 and part of Act 3 do show their longness and tooth. And I can't decide how much I've demerited that game because of that. And that my desire to take a break either was enhancing what felt like a long period or proof that these were like weaknesses. It's hard to like say in either direction, but I think that's something else to think about. Whenever you take a break with an RPG, is it also kind of indicative of, hey, maybe you're not enjoying it as much as you thought? I don't think that's always true. Sometimes it's true. Because you know what game that's true for? Star Ocean: The First Departure. I have put that game down so many times because I'm not enjoying it. I'm doing it just to complete it because I want to play Star Ocean 2. But if I'm honest, I do not like this game. I don't... Like, it started off cool. The private actions are cool, but the rest of this game is boring. And it's just what it is. Between that and Ni no Kuni 2, those games are so boring, but it is... I'm going to put those games down for a long time and then come back, chip away, go back. And those are truly indicative of, I do not like these experiences. Then I think about one of the games that's actually excellent. Because one of the things we don't talk about is that obviously we talk about getting back into combat, getting back into stories. Getting back into stories is hard. It's difficult. The best game I've seen do this is Dragon Quest XI. Because whenever you go back to Dragon Quest XI, it does a nice story summary, a nice reminder of the stakes, reminder of what it situates you back in. It's the reason why, for me, as much as I don't like the beginning premise of Act 3, I will go back. Strictly because it's they know how to funnel you back in. And I think it proves it more so with Dragon Quest, because Dragon Quest is a long game. And so that I think the elements of like it feeling like a story, fairy tale type of experience, like it all takes all those elements forward. And so therefore they're always waiting for you to come back. It's always waiting as a comfort experience. And so I wish more games had that, where you turn on the game again and it gives you a nice little story summary. I think the only other one that I'm remembering off the top of my head that has that technique is Pokemon. I think it was Fire Red and Leaf Green, where you ran back to the Pokemon Center or something like that, where they gave you just a nice blip of like what's happening. I think another reason why, going back to Tales of Vesperia for a second, was really effective is that it has a nice in-menu description of everything. While I felt the combat stuff was confusing, which is why I had to Google online, all the story stuff, like it'd have a little chapter summary, some of the character stuff, and I wish more RPGs had that, where you could have a nice story summary in the menu, a nice description of certain characters, a description of certain locations, just to like regain your bearings. Because I think that is like the ultimate thing of like, these games have these sprawling, epic stories, but if you leave out certain things, you're just going to be lost. It's part of the reason why even something like, when I think of Triangle Strategy, the fact that you can press the control stick to see the summary of every character, the fact that you can go back and to see the story thus far, small bits and pieces like that help you just be like, okay, putting it together. Because I think that is the reason why I think getting back in the story of JRPGs is difficult. There are these long epics, and a nice place to go back and recap more effectively is useful. And why are you bringing this up, right? It's because I picked up Xenoblade after 2 years. So I bought Xenoblade the day of release, and when I tell you I demolished 25 hours in a weekend, I have not done that in years. I loved it. it was unhealthy. And I was in the middle of trying to sort out some dissertation stuff. And I was like, all right, I gotta put this down. Because if I continue this, it's going to be a problem. And so I finally graduated recently. And I said to myself, it's time to go back to the world of Xenoblade 3. And it's exciting. But I tell you, I do not remember the story as well as I thought. And trying to get back into mechanics, it was difficult. And the thing that got me specifically about the story of Xenoblade 3, because there's a lot of things I love and I'm starting to get back my bearings. They do have a theater, but it's not in the core menu in the sense of, why should I leave the game save to go watch the events? That doesn't make sense. You would think that you'd have them there in case someone wants to like refresh. And then in the core menu, you don't, for all the information it gives you such a meticulous description of the battle thing. And so I'm going to talk about remembering how battles work. But it doesn't give you like the bios of all the people in front of you. Fortunately, I'm starting to remember everything is jogging my memory. I think, honestly, the props to all those side quests, because those side quests flesh out your characters and you can be like, oh, that's what's happened. Like, it does a great job. These side quests are really well designed. But I say that to say, give me the description of what is it, Ouroboros P and O that I beat. Just give me a little description. Give me that, man. Because I'm facing the other guys who are like, do you remember where you beat this? I was like, I remember the battle. What was the context again? Why did I destroy the flame blocks again? I had to like remind myself all of that. And what I did what I did, which is go on YouTube to read people's summaries, go on YouTube to rewatch cutscenes. And I just thinking specifically about Tales of Vesperia and both Dragon Quest XI. I'm like, I wish they had both, which is a nice story summary of what just happened in your actual gameplay, like Dragon Quest XI does, and gives you a little bit of a clarity of where to go. But more importantly, just like a nice glossary of the map, nice glossary of what's going on. For what is a really complex, dense story with so many layers, you would think that you'd have an interim glossary like Tales of Vesperia. And it's not that Tales of Vesperia isn't complicated. It's just, I guess for me, sci-fi stuff always feels much denser and richer. Like, I love Gundam, right? Like, I really do. But I'm the guy who searching up, like, so the war of which one? Just trying to always keep together the way that lore works in these worlds. And I think Xenoblade 3, as much as it took a lot more effort to get back into it. Surprisingly, though, the gameplay was actually easier to kind of piece together. It's a lot going on screen. Anybody who's played Xenoblade 3, it's a lot on screen. But really, as I said, they went out of their way. Apparently, whatever happened in Xenoblade 2 that I don't have an experience with was so daunting, but the level of like step-by-step processes that you need to do to be able to figure out how to make the combat system work is all here really dense, but really clear. And so getting back into the rhythm of understanding, I mean, I'll never forget the break, topple, smash, daze, smash, I'll never forget that. But just like how bleed works, positioning, and then specifically how chain attacks work in this, which is so rich. Yeah, I'm going to save some of that for what I've been grinding on, but just to highlight that I wish it got the best of both worlds, where at least mechanically I'm able to get a lot, but I wish story-wise I was able to get a little bit more. But I got back into it, and it hasn't really hampered my appreciation. I'm remembering how I felt about these characters. I remember some of the story beats, and so I'm back in. It took a lot of work. I'm not going to lie and sit here and say I didn't have to go watch a video, I listed everything. But it goes back to the core idea, which is I think some folks think when you drop a game, your ability to appreciate is hampered. And I just don't think so. And I think particularly RPGs, I'm not fond of restarting unless I truly didn't understand the game, which there are a couple of games that's reflected that. Like if I were to ever get a copy of my old Tales of Symphonia back in the day, I would restart that because I didn't understand RPGs. I just didn't. But for these where I'm like, I have an understanding of a genre, it's just that the uniqueness of each one just takes work to get back into. And so I don't think it's hampered. And I guess that's going back to that central question. Can this hamper you? Can this affect your ability to appreciate or enjoy the genre? And I think right now the answer is no, but I know that that is not reflective of everybody. And I think folks would be like, oh, you took a break in this game, you took a break in that game. Do you even like these games? And the answer is I do. Just my life. How I play and how my life works, it just fits. Which leads me into, okay, so you've talked about getting back into games. So which game were you getting back into? Xenoblade 3. And, oh man, I'm full of like very interesting memories and feelings. And then now I'm just like looking at what they're doing. I'm just like, this warms me. I think I've said, it's funny. So since I've played Xeno 3 and I got partway through chapter 4, now that I'm completed that, there's one idea in this game and I think I've undervalued because I've now seen it in other media and I'm just like, oh, I see how Xenoblade 3 is doing it and it's doing it quite beautifully. In the beginning of Captain Marvel, when all three are finally together, when Spectrum gets to see Captain Marvel's memory of her mother, and because of them wearing the thing that links their memories, it's a really good conceit. I really enjoyed it. I know most people don't like that movie, but I liked how that worked as like a scene of just like proving something's happening. I was like, oh, this is a thing. This is a bigger trope because Xeno has that, but it works differently, right? So each pair in the Ouroboros can see each other's memories, and I was like, oh, right, you can. And I think what it's done is that there's a specific level of empathy that these pairs are having for one another. Like, I think so much of this, right? There's a moment right now with Lance gets to see Senna's memory. And up until this moment, I like those two a lot. And a lot of how they interact has been great. But I think I'm at the point now where I'm like, oh, there's something else going on to Senna. And I'm realizing, I don't know if Lance would have had the emotional maturity to recognize how Senna's reacting. But because he has access to her memories, he's starting to see, oh, wait, so some of what you're doing is putting on an external energy because of something that happened. And so he's starting to piece together. He's trying to reach out to her, and she's like, "Don't engage. Don't mess with what I have on." And it's like, oh, there's a lot more emotional touch and consideration that's happening in this game. And I don't know how else to frame it besides that, because I'm reminded that Taion has done the same thing with Uni, particularly because Uni has a flashback of the Mobius that I fought, but we don't really know the context of that yet. But he started to notice it when they were first making this trek. And she's just like trying to hide it. And so I don't know if he has access to her memories fully yet, because he's not made that comment the way that Lance has. But I think what's just been beautiful to see is that there is an emotional intelligence in responding to just the feelings of some of these characters and wanting to engage in them in a way that I just think is very friendly. And like, it feels the closest to how my friendships with my folks are, right? And I guess it's just a testament to just like really well-written, thoughtful characters, and the pathos not always having to be dramatic. It's the small moments of compassion that show up throughout. And so I've enjoyed getting back into space. I think what I've really grown to appreciate is that even just the little bits that show up in the side stories is just always great. Right, like right now, I stopped chapter 5 to go back to where Colony Gamma, where Mio is, and it is so fascinating to see how they set that up. You're like, hold on, wait, and you start realizing, oh, these are really lived areas, and how people are going to respond to you because of what the end of chapter 2 discussions are, and you're like, oh, right. The way that you've had an impact on the world is going to respond to what you're doing very differently. And it's more complicated because these folks are from these places. And to know that that's what's connected to the job system, it makes it just feel so much more richer of an experience, where I'm in these places and I'm like, yeah, I want to get the job, but I'm really curious about, like, what is Mio's history? Because that's the other thing that I forget with this game, is that the game starts off very Noah-centric, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. But they do so many build up because of what's his name, Yoren, as a rebuilt version of himself as a villain, and you're like, oh shoot, what's crazy? And then you go into Kev's castle, you do all of this, and you go back and you start being like, wait, I don't know anything on Mio's side, and you don't think about that. If you never, this case, if I never went and did the side story, I might have missed out on a whole relationship building. And I think it's just one of those things where it compounds where Senna is at, where you're starting to recognize that Senna's a loner, or how she related back to Mio. And you're like, oh, and then so to go back where they started, it feels so organic. It feels like it's how it was supposed to be, even though I know that you could have gotten the job, I think it's Thamar Taraj, a minute ago. It's been so wonderful to be back with these characters. I don't know who I'm going to say is my favorite of the cast. Tyon at one point was. Senna right now is coming up to the forefront. Noah and Mio, obviously. But it's a really strong cast of folks who have gone through a lot. And I'm excited to see how it blows up in our face. Because that's the other thing, right? Spoilers for Chapter 4 of Xenoblade 3. I know it's been a minute. You blow off the face of Melia, and it's a robot. Ooh, what does that mean? And I know many of you are like, oh, I know what that means. But I don't know. And I am excited because you see Console N, and you're like, that has to be a version of Noah. And Console M has to be a version of Mia. And you're like, okay, is there some time travel? Probably. It's Xenoblade. These are figs on the table. But I want to go back to the second piece. I love these chain attacks. One of the things that folks I remember have said over the years is that the focus on chain attacks makes the pacing boring or kind of tiring. And I'm just like, maybe I'm tripping. I like that it feels like it's primarily a game that when you're in the MMO flow stage, right? Like you have a bunch of auto attacks, you can position, you do that. It's all mostly real time. I like that the chain attacks is a pause to something more of a turn-based experience. And it's two different ways of thinking at work, right? You're very reactionary at the very beginning of any battle. And you're like, okay, I need to position over here. I need to use these fusion arts. We'll even get into that. But what I've liked is that the chain attacks cause you to be like, oh, let me create a grand strategy from beginning to end. Because you're like, if I time it right, if I set these things up right, I can chain 3 chain attacks and an Ouroboros attack. And I think that level of thinking for me is always exciting. And I think what I like is that you get the buff of attack. So for those who don't know, a chain attack works like this. You go into this menu, you pick something that affects your stats, and then you have all your party you can choose from, and you're trying to at least hit 100. If you hit 100, you reactivate. If you get to 150, you get more characters to jump back in. So that's the key thing, is that if you use multiple characters, they don't necessarily come back the second time around if you eclipse 100. But if you get to like 150 or 200, they jump back in. And so if you plan the attacks right, it works out. And then you have to synergize. So the job system has an attacker, a healer, and a defender. And so you try to pick folks who synergize with each other to maximize the points to get across. I mean, you have a guest character who, if you time it right with them, they create what is a bare minimum of a Bravo, which is an automatic reset. There's so much here. And I was like, it gets so exciting to be like, okay, who do I want to pick? How do I synergize with them? Because healing can't get you over 100. That's another thing. It's bit by bit so great. And then the final piece, which is that they give you 3 characters to start from as your stat modifier. And then you restart, they give you another set of characters. If you pick characters together who are part of the Ouroboros system, right, like a natural pair storyline-wise, you get them to transform into Ouroboros to do special attacks. So that means if you damage sync everything up, you can have 3 chain attacks and then an Ouroboros attack on top of that, with the increased damage percentage of the attacks consistently increasing. It is so awesome. Like, I don't know how people don't like that. I get it that you don't want to do that for regular enemies. And so I know it can be tiring that, but for like boss battles, I love being able to like, oh, I built up, let's go in. And this is kind of the other thing, is that the idea of characters being connected together is mechanically is just, that's the other thing that I love. I love the fusion. or how do I even explain this to people? So, as I said, this is more of an MMORPG battle system. And so you have two different styles of recharge attack. So you're always auto attacking, but you have a panel of attacks. So you have 3 from your core class and then 3 from classes from the other part of the army, right? So that's the other thing. Your 2 sides, I think it's Keves and Ionios, have 2 different styles of jobs. And you're trying to like always pull skills from each of the job, because you can't have overlap because they recharge differently. You have ones that recharge based on time and ones that recharge based on your auto attack. And then if you time those together, you can fuse those attacks together, and that builds your fusion meter to create aura. It's so good, man. I don't want to hear. It is baffling to me that folks don't like this. Don't get me wrong. I could understand some of the core critiques if you want to go into the gem conversation and the equipment conversation. That's fair, and I don't like that you max out at 10 so early, because you're changing jobs so much that it's like at some point in time when you get into a job that you like, you just don't feel comfortable staying there because you're like, oh man, I'm losing class points. But outside of that, just as like how it highlights together mechanically these 2 disparate parts of the war coming together, that they have different styles of jobs, different styles of combat, and using them together and switching back and forth. It's good, man. I don't know what to tell you. It's why I'm like, I guess I'm going to make this side thing. I do not mind if the Xenoblade folks want to do a different combat system. I just don't want to ever lose this. Because that's the one thing I never get. It's like, I get it. Folks prefer a more traditional action system, and that's great. I don't want to take that away from people. I like that. And I do agree that it might be more appealing. But sometimes I feel like folks don't appreciate how novel this is. What other single-player RPG has a cooldown system built like this? They're, at least off the top of my head, the closest is what the FF12 niggas was doing. But if it ain't the FF12 cats, if it ain't them, who else? Who else we talking about? And so I hope if they make the switch, I'm happy, I'm cool. But it tells me that. And so I want to give the job system some more thought about the synergies and stuff like that. I think that, as I mentioned, the only issue I've had is that you class up so quickly that it's like you don't, and you feel like you waste class points if you're not always switching. And so it's hard to stay cozy in one particular place. But we'll save that for the next time I play Xenoblade 3. But as you can tell, I'm infatuated. I love this system. The final thing I want to talk about is the Bard's Tale, right? What is the Bard's Tale for this week? So probably about a month or so ago, I started just going back through the Atelier Ryza soundtracks and their main themes. And oh my gosh, is it good? Is it great? Is it wonderful? It is all these things. And so Atelier Ryza 2, I've never played these games. One day I'll get around to it. I've never played these games. And so I listened to the main theme for Atelier Ryza 2, Some When Somewhere by Clambon. Sublime. The first thing I will just say, if you love any of the Kirby soundtracks, you need to spin this song. This song easily, especially on something like Kirby and the Forgotten World, could easily be on a soundtrack like that. Especially now that Kirby is doing more vocal tracks, you could easily transfer it. It's that there's a little bit of a farm vibe. There's a little bit of a clammy calypso-ish vibe, but more importantly, it is the classic anime opening theme. But it's just those instruments, man. It is. When those chimes and flutes come in, you're just whisked away. I prefer the song without the actual core percussion, but the chimes, the flute, the string, it is so peaceful and tranquil, and it is so calming, and it is that kind of like bright sky, early morning energy, that sense of like hope and optimism. And then it has, the reason why I made that Kirby comparison is like, go listen to some of the Kirby percussion for like a wispy, one of those green areas, or for some of those, even some of the more like darker areas. You recognize those rock drum patterns. It's so good. And so if you've never given that a listen, do it. There's a beat drop that you're just like, shoot. shoot. Yeah. And so I want to spend some more time on Atelier Ryza eventually, because if the soundtrack is like this, is a cleansing energy that I'm feeling from it. But these are the experiences of what I've been having. And so this is the beginning of season 2. I'm hoping to have more episodes for you. As I say, every 2 weeks is just a wonderful time to be here right now. It means a lot that you guys have shown up for every episode. And if you want to leave a review on Spotify, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, that would help this podcast a lot. And if there's something you want me to talk about, please let me know. I think in this season, without getting too much into it, I'm probably going to need a little bit of support from the folks who are listening, as thinking of things to talk about. I'm not in the same space I was in before, but I won't really get into details of that for now. That being said, welcome to the new season, and I think the safest thing you can expect is some more Xenoblade 3 talk, where I'm more ingratiated in going on. Leave a like, comment, review, and I'm the Wolves Den 25 again. You can find me on Twitter, you can find me on Instagram, you can find me on Blue Sky, you can find me on Threads. You can find Menu Combat at Twitter, Spotify, and Threads. Come and shout out. Oh, last thing. If you want to hear me talk more, right? As I said, this is a seasonal. I'm not always going to be around. I did show up on the Wonder of Anime podcast, talking about 5 centimeters per second. Oh my gosh, that was so fun. Lisa is incredible. And I've said it before, but I don't think I've ever said it on this podcast. Half of the love of why I have for the JRPGs is coming from my history with anime. And so if you want to hear some just me waxing poetic about Makoto Shinkai's 5 centimeters per second, go listen to the Wonder of Anime. They have an incredible backlog of episodes. I would also tell you to go listen to the Princess Tutu episode, because Princess Tutu is legendary, and you gotta do that. Lisa's incredible. Go listen to that podcast. But if you're like, I want to hear you some more of the Wolves Den, that's where you go. On that note, keep changing the world, and don't forget to pause, customize your party. Much love.